Uh, Welcome everyone to Build the Dictator Workshop. We are your hosts. I am known as the arms of the operation. Rebecca, what are you known for?
I'm the heart.
You're the heart?
I'm the legs.
The legs. And?
I'm the head.
And the head. Alright, so I have a question for you guys. How many of you guys have been to Build-A-Bear Workshop? Or at least heard of it? Alright, so it's sort of like that, but it's way better. Because we're going to be talking about our two favorite dictators, Mao and Hitler.
That's right. So to start off, to build our bear, we're obviously going to need legs. How do they literally rise to power? So, technical difficulties.
Serious?
Oh no, get out. No. Stop looking.
Wait.
Go back, pause it. Hold on.
We're
I
not
got
pausing
it.
anything. I quit.
Smart. Alright, there. Okay, so Hitler and Mao both arose from the divisive conditions of the political strife or conflict in their nations, thus enabling them to introduce their radical politics to a more receptive audience, an audience that would be more likely to accept their views. So, in first comparing Hitler and Mao together, we can look at two crucial events and analyze them as to how they affect the conditions of their rise. So, for Hitler, we looked at the 1923 Franco-Belgian incursion into the Ruhr Valley, called the Ruhrkampf, literally a struggle for the Ruhr. So what we can see in the photo right there is a French soldier, rather, harassing a German worker, and it really goes to show the angst that the Germans felt following the First World War, based on the Treaty of Versailles. From this, we can derive three themes, more or less, in these conditions. A foreign theme, in which Germany, of course, per the Treaty of Versailles, had already lost 13% of its territory, was forced to accept guilt, and now you have foreign troops coming into your most industrious region of your country, taking it over for something as measly as a telephone pole shipment being missed. It has an effect on the German population that they begin to see themselves as alienated, and they begin to develop resentment. In addition, there's a political factor. Despite already having radical leftist tendencies, especially in Germany, it's why Berlin could not be the capital of this new Germany, and Weimar had to, because Berlin was the center of political conflict boiling over as communists and nationalists were fighting in the streets, essentially. Germans began to awake to the abuse that the Allies were inflicting on them, especially with the 1923 invasion of the Ruhr. So it's really no surprise that at the end of 1923, the NSDAP had gained 55,000 new members as a result of witnessing what was an incursion onto their country. In addition, there was a cultural element of an uncontrollable hyperinflation by the government that really deepened this cultural trend that historian A.J.P. Taylor describes as a military culture in Germany, that Germans believe an autocracy is the most efficient form of government, and it's also the proper form of government. A democracy is inept, and that's why it leads to uncontrollable hyperinflation. The government can't control its money supply. We see something similar in pre-Mao China, in that in light of the civil repression and conflict by both foreign and domestic powers from 1900 to 1918, the Chinese lashed out at the fragmentation of their nation and identity, which allowed for this receptivity for reform to ferment. So we see once again there are three themes that we can derive from the 4th of May movement occurring in 1918, May 4th, obviously. And what we see in this picture here is thousands of Chinese coming together, despite their political differences, although we'll get into that later, coming to protest the unfair settlement of the Treaty of Versailles, which, going into a foreign influence, we see that China had not necessarily forced, but China had lost many territories, offshore territories, such as Shandong, to Japan, and those territories had been colonized by the Germans beforehand, and they were regarded as ethnically Chinese. However, they were given to the Japanese based on a treaty signed thousands of miles away in Europe. So the Chinese had already been feeling infringed upon by the Opium Wars, the Qing Dynasty, the recent dictatorship they'd overthrown, and this really just cemented the idea that we are alone and we need to rise up. It's a similar thing to Germany. In addition, there was a political element that the Chinese had felt impeded on by the West in 1918, but it was also a recent overthrow that they had endured of Yuan Shikai, who ruled as a dictator for about 4 years, from 1912 to 1916. And as a result, the Chinese felt as though they had a right, they had an obligation to rise up and assert themselves as dominant if they were to be ruled by someone else. And once again, a cultural divide, in that there was a clear ideological decadence towards Confucianism. There was contempt almost by some Chinese who would later become communists. That Confucianism, which is a form of traditionalism in Chinese, was not suitable to ruling this new society, and as a result, there began to develop an ideological divide between we become more nationalist towards embracing Confucianism and traditionalism, or should we begin to move away and accept newer Western ideas? And this schism would help to really transform the ideological plane of China, especially after 1920 with the translation of the Communist Manifesto. So we can see that Hitler and Mao compare in the conditions of their rise through the conditions of a nationally perturbed or disturbed population, culture, and political scene. However, they contrast in the methods that they use, the immediate methods that is, to rise to power directly. So while Hitler and Mao compare in societal conditions in the conflicts to which they arose, they differ in the methods of gaining control of the situation. We can see in Hitler's case, following the Reichstag fire of 1933, whether or not, of course, there is a conspiracy that Hitler had started it, whether or not that is true, it was blamed on a Dutch communist. Specifically, that it was blamed on a communist. This gave Hitler the incentive to push Hindenburg to pass the 1933 Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler to pass, or rather the Chancellor, to pass any laws at his own whim, his or her own whim. And as a result, all KPD members were banned in February, and all opposition began to become imprisoned. Hitler was really cementing his power, and at this point, one could argue that he was in absolute power. So we can see that Hitler relied on legal measures to assume control. He relied on the tactics in his government. But Mao was different. During the Long March of 1934 to 1935, Mao had taken 86,000 men to begin with, but had lost thousands of those along the way. Had only 20,000 when he regrouped with Zhang's force of 80,000 men. And Mao had already asserted himself at the Tongdao Conference of 1934, in asserting himself as the leader. However, Zhang's superior force had threatened to take away that power. So what does Mao do? Well, Mao sacrifices more of his men to divert from Zhang's army and instead go towards Shaanxi, where, despite the fact that he loses thousands of men, he's able to retain his political power and eventually reestablish and reform it in Shaanxi. So Mao was able to consolidate himself as a leader in his army, not necessarily in power yet, but as a leader through his military tactics and his position. And we can see through two pictures Mao being portrayed as a leader and leading a group of soldiers and peasants. And of course we can see here the ruins of the Reichstag after the fire. So dictators, more or less, are aided by societal chaos and national confusion, which allows their ideas to ferment more receptively. They settle in more receptively. However different their methods may be.
So now it's time to work on building your heart, building this blood that's going to pump through your society. So, in comparison, you need a cult of personality. You need to have a big personality that's willing to sacrifice nothing in order to make themselves look great. You have Hitler's cult, and then you have Mao's cult. So Hitler has the Führersyndrome, which is built on strong and bitter nationalistic feelings after the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, when Germany lost 13% of their land. Hitler's cult was based on blaming the weak liberal democracy that formed after the Weimar Constitution was signed, and then built this cult surrounding himself through his powerful, charismatic speaking, and then he was also idolized by propaganda, most of which he and Goebbels wrote. Then in Mao's cult, you have bitter resentment. So both of these ties have this utter feeling and this shared angst and anger against someone. Both are also idolized by propaganda. As shown in both pictures, Mao and Hitler are shown to be superior. They're superior beings. In China, even went to the extent that Mao is the sun. There's this story, Tang Zhenhe's son, who was maybe 6 at the time, criticized his father because his father said that the sun was a ball of fire and not Mao. So, in addition, another comparison in between their ideologies is that they had published ideology. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in 1925 when he was in prison, and also had the NSDAP's 25-point plan, which clearly outlined all of the ideology that the state would use once it took over. Mao had the Little Red Book, which was published after he took over. It was published in January of 1964, and it had 267 quotes from everything from politics to economics to even education. This was given to the army. School children were required to have their own copy, and it basically became the sole book that you could guarantee every Chinese citizen would have. Now, in contrast, you have their ideology, what they wanted to do. Hitler wanted to continue. He wanted continuity in his ideology. He used ideas from the past. He used social Darwinism, which was founded in the late 1800s. He used Lebensraum, which was in the early 1900s, and then used this anti-Western modernization, such as his movement against jazz music due to jazz's influences from both Jewish and African populations. There was also the anti-progressive woman, where they basically said that because a woman is trying to push herself into society, that's where some of the problems are coming from. So they very much so encouraged women to be held back and be in the home. Now, on the other hand, Mao was revolutionary. He wanted to change how his country worked. So he encouraged public self-criticism and even criticizing others in public. So this was seen during the Speak Bitterness campaign, where they were trying to overthrow the landlord class, and then in struggle sessions, further taking out the landlords. Now, he also used peasants as the backbone of society rather than Hitler using Aryans. Women were encouraged to modernize and work alongside the men, eliminating this gender difference. The anti-right campaign was after the 100 Flowers campaign, and it was this harsh repression that prevented any backslip of going back from communism. And then Mao also promoted destroying the Four Olds, which is customs, culture, habits, and ideas, in order to modernize China. So overall, both sets of ideology appeal to the public. It's just how the culture of your state will change and adapt to your ideology. That's what's going to dictate what kind of ideology you use.